Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with another episode in my long-running Unsolved Mysteries series. Before we begin, don't forget to hit like and subscribe and the notification bell and turn on all notifications if you haven't done so already. On the afternoon of February 9th, 1989, a 20-year-old University of Florida junior named Tiffany Sessions told her roommate she was heading out for a power walk. It was something she'd been doing regularly since returning from Christmas break, a daily routine along a familiar route near her off-campus apartment in Gainesville. She left sometime between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, wearing red sweatpants, a white pullover sweatshirt with Aspen printed on the collar, and tennis shoes. She had a black Sony Walkman and a distinctive two-tone Rolex watch on her wrist. She didn't take her wallet, her keys, or her identification. She expected to return within the hour, but she never came back, and by around 7 that evening, Tiffany's roommate, Kathleen Frezza, knew something was wrong. She drove along Tiffany's usual walking route, searching for any sign of her. When she found nothing, she called the Alachua County Sheriff's Office, and then Tiffany's parents, Patrick and Hillary Sessions. It was the beginning of one of the largest missing person searches in the history of Florida, and a case that more than 3 decades later still hasn't been fully resolved. Tiffany Sessions was born on October 29th, 1968, and her mom, who was in the Air Force, largely raised her on her own as they moved around the country. By the time she reached college, Tiffany had grown into an independent and driven young woman. She was studying finance at the University of Florida, with ambitions of one day running her own company. Her father, Patrick, was a prominent South Florida real estate developer who oversaw some of the largest building projects in the state, and she hoped to work with him one day. She lived in the Casablanca East condominiums on Southwest 35th Place, about 5 miles from the main campus. In what would later be seen as a potential vector of attack, her walking route took her along a wooded stretch of road near clusters of student apartment buildings. In 1989, there was no standardized protocol for missing persons cases in Florida. Hillary later recalled that investigators initially suggested Tiffany might simply be out with friends, a response she found frustrating because it didn't match her daughter's character. There was no evidence of a struggle at Tiffany's apartment, and no indication she'd left the parking lot area voluntarily for any extended trip. Some witnesses reported seeing a woman matching Tiffany's description, speaking to individuals inside a vehicle near her walking route, and the woman may have gotten into the car. However, the witnesses weren't certain, and authorities never confirmed whether the person was actually Tiffany. What was clear from the start was that despite what the cops initially said, this wasn't a voluntary disappearance. Her personal belongings were still in her apartment. Her car was still parked outside. Everything pointed to someone taking her against her will. If the initial law enforcement response was slow to gain traction, Tiffany's father more than compensated. Patrick Sessions threw every resource and connection he had into finding his daughter. Within a week of Tiffany's disappearance, he organized a massive search that even included members of the Miami Dolphins. Volunteers wore white t-shirts emblazoned with Tiffany's name and a toll-free hotline number, and at the peak of the campaign, that hotline was receiving up to 600 calls a day. Patrick didn't stop there, retaining the services of a team of private investigators that specialized in missing persons cases. He got Tiffany's picture printed inside every pizza delivery box in Alachua County so that everyone would be familiar with her appearance. He organized a press conference featuring Dolphins quarterback Dan Marino, John Walsh, and future Florida Governor Jeb Bush, launching the case into the national spotlight. When the local sheriff's office advised that people were trying to contact them by fax, but that they didn't have a fax machine, Patrick bought one for their office. Her case appeared on national television, and Patrick offered a hefty $250,000 reward for information on his daughter. Despite this massive private investigation along with the public investigation, the effort tragically turned up nothing. For years, a convicted criminal named Michael Christopher Knickerbocker drew attention as a possible suspect. Knickerbocker was serving 5 consecutive life sentences for a series of brutal crimes against women and girls. While in prison, he reportedly told fellow inmates that he'd slain Tiffany, claiming he'd chained her to a tree near Gainesville. He claimed that he later disposed of her body in the Caloosahatchee River near Fort Myers. He also claimed her sweatshirt was buried outside of Gainesville, and in 2002, a blood-soaked garment was found in the area. The results of forensic testing on that piece of clothing was never released, and there's nothing to indicate that it was related to the case at this point. Patrick Sessions himself went public in 1994 with his belief that Knickerbocker was involved. But upon further investigation, there was a significant problem when it turned out Knickerbocker wasn't living in Gainesville at the time of Tiffany's disappearance. His known crimes were all committed near victims who lived proximate to him, and investigators began to have doubts. I assume they also had some other reasons to suspect he wasn't involved, but given that this is an active and ongoing investigation, we may never know. When directly confronted by detectives, Knickerbocker never confessed to the crime, but he did provide some information. He admitted to writing an anonymous letter claiming responsibility, though he wouldn't speak on his motives for this. In my view, I suspect that this guy was just a sicko who, having been locked up for life, wanted a way to further victimize innocent people. Also, I say this with the benefit of hindsight, since the other prime suspect seems to fit the fact scenario of her case much better than Knickerbocker. The real breakthrough came decades later, driven in part by a woman who'd never forgotten the case. Sadie Darnell had been an employee of the Alachua County Sheriff's Office when Tiffany disappeared in 1989. Though she was never assigned to the case, she stayed in touch with Patrick Sessions over the years, sending him letters of encouragement. When Darnell was elected sheriff in 2006, she established the county's first cold case unit, with Tiffany's case being marked as high priority. The key development began in 2012, when advancing forensic technology allowed investigators to link DNA evidence to a man named Paul Rowles. But this wasn't in connection to Tiffany's case, but rather in connection to the slaying of Elizabeth Foster. Foster was a 21-year-old Santa Fe Community College student whose body was found in a shallow grave in 1992. She was found roughly a mile from where Tiffany had disappeared 3 years earlier. Interestingly, Hillary Sessions had always believed the two cases were connected, and it turned out she may have been right. Paul Rowles had a deeply troubled history. Born in 1948 in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, he grew up in a severely dysfunctional household. His father, a veteran, was extremely violent, and his mother suffered from serious mental illness and was in and out of institutions. In 1972, Rowles entered Linda Fida's Miami apartment and strangled her. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but under the light sentencing laws of the era, he was paroled in 1985. After his release, he moved to the Gainesville area, where he worked for a company that delivered construction equipment. That job placed him directly along the route Tiffany Sessions walked every afternoon. And chillingly, records showed that Rowles didn't report to work the day Tiffany vanished. If he was the perpetrator, given that Tiffany had a fairly set schedule for her power walks, he could have lurked in the woods waiting for her to come by. In 1994, Rowles kidnapped a 15-year-old girl from her family's apartment in Clearwater, binding her with duct tape after forcing her into his car at knife point. He drove her 200 miles away to Jacksonville, where it became apparent that he wasn't going to let her live. But in a moment of remarkable courage, the teenager managed to escape by unlocking the front door and moving a tire he'd used to barricade it while he wasn't looking. She remains the only known survivor among Rolls' victims, and for this crime he was convicted of kidnapping and indecent assault and sentenced to 19 years in prison. Now I just have to jump in here with my personal commentary, since at this point he was already convicted in relation to the Linda Fita case. I really have to question how someone like this was only given 19 years, meaning that he could have very likely been out prowling the streets once again. Thankfully, though, Rolls' reign of terror was effectively over since he died of lung cancer in prison in February 2013. After his death, investigators gained access to items from his cell, including a calendar and address book that cataloged his victims. The book listed Linda Fita as his first crime and also contained what appeared to be a reference to Elizabeth Foster. It also contained the notation, Number 2, February 9th, 1989, which investigators believe referred to the date of Tiffany Sessions' disappearance and identified her as Rolls' second victim. I'll come back to this in a second, though, since I don't think this necessarily is as strong circumstantial evidence as the cops believe it is. In February 2014, exactly 25 years after Tiffany disappeared, Sheriff Darnell held a press conference announcing Rolls as the prime suspect. She described the circumstantial evidence as overwhelming, though she acknowledged that a direct connection between Rolls and Tiffany didn't exist. Investigators conducted extensive searches in areas associated with Rolls' other crimes, including a 2-week dig near the site where Foster's body had been found. At one point, sniffer dogs gave strong alerts at several spots, but further excavation revealed the dogs had been reacting to buried septic tanks from an old trailer park. Additional searches in 2020 on a tract of commercial timberland, prompted by tips matching the descriptions of Tiffany and Rolls, also yielded no new evidence. Notably, Tiffany's Rolex watch has been flagged by the manufacturer so that any attempt to sell or pawn it will trigger a notification, but it's never surfaced. Her body has never been found, and she's been excluded from over 150 Jane Doe cases across the United States. Personally, I think the big break may come from that flagged Rolex, which may still be owned by an entirely innocent party. This is speculation on my part, but I suspect he may have sold it for pennies on the dollar immediately after the crime. Perhaps one day the owner of that watch, or their relative, might attempt to sell it, which could trigger a break that confirms Rolls as the culprit. As for that diary connection, I think it's possible that Rolls may have sought to claim an additional victim without actually being involved. We know that he was the sort of person who took pride in his sick acts, and he may have sought to inflate his victim count, as many individuals like this tend to do. That said, this has to be balanced against the fact that he was absent from work on the day she disappeared, as well as his prior and subsequent crimes. There's a gap in one of the most important paintings in the history of Western art, and it's been there for over 90 years. The Ghent altarpiece, also known as the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, was completed in 1432 by the brothers Hubert and Jan van Eyck. It's widely considered the first major oil painting in European art, a groundbreaking work that changed how artists thought about color, light, and realism. It sits today in St. Bavo's Cathedral in Ghent, Belgium, but if you visit and look at the lower left panel, what you're seeing isn't a Van Eyck original. It's actually a copy, and more interestingly perhaps, it's a copy by a man that some believe was in on the heist. The real panel, known as the Just Judges, was stolen on the night of April 10th, 1934, and it hasn't been seen since. The panel depicted mounted horsemen riding toward the altarpiece's central scene, where a lamb stands on an altar as a symbol of Christ's sacrifice. The figures are believed to include Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy and possibly the Van Eyck brothers themselves. What happened to it is one of the most tantalizing mysteries in art crime history, and despite decades of investigation, Nobody's been able to solve it. On the morning of April 11th, 1934, a bell ringer arrived at St. Bavo's Cathedral to begin his daily rounds. After a few hours, he noticed the lock on the door to the chapel had been forced open. When he entered, 2 panels were missing from the altarpiece: the Just Judges from the interior side, and the painting of St. John the Baptist from the exterior. The panels had been set back to back in an oak frame braced with iron bars, and the entire double-sided unit was gone. It was roughly 5 feet tall and 1.5 feet wide, making it no small feat for anyone to remove in the dark. What followed was a disastrously bungled response, a master class in what not to do following a major art heist. News of the theft leaked immediately, and an estimated 1,500 members of the public flooded into the chapel, trampling through the scene and obliterating any forensic evidence. Hilariously, the Ghent police commissioner showed up briefly before leaving to take lead on an investigation at a separate robbery at a nearby cheese shop. No fingerprints were collected, no photographs were taken. A note left on the altarpiece's frame read, in French, that the panels had been taken by Germany due to the Treaty of Versailles. It was a red herring designed to suggest the theft was German political revenge, referencing the return of several altarpiece panels to Belgium under the treaty's reparation terms. 19 days after the theft, the Bishop of Ghent received a ransom demand for 1 million Belgian francs. If the church didn't pay, the panels would be destroyed. The letter was signed with the cryptic initials DUA. The bishop was willing to negotiate, but the Belgian public prosecutor and the Minister of Justice refused to authorize payment. Higher-ups in the Catholic Church were willing to put forward the money, but the Belgian authorities frowned upon this as setting a dangerous precedent. Nevertheless, the bishop cooperated outwardly and continued a delicate back and forth with the anonymous extortionist. As a gesture of supposed good faith, the thief returned the St. John the Baptist panel, leaving it in the checked luggage department of the Ghent train station. This revealed that the original double-sided panel had been sliced vertically in half, separating the 2 painted surfaces. This good faith effort by the criminal brought the authorities back on board with some money being set aside for the ransom. A total of 12 letters were exchanged, each containing strange instructions in coded language. At one point, a priest of St. Laurentius Parish in Antwerp was designated to hand over the money. The police gave him a parcel containing only 25,000 francs instead of the demanded million. A taxi driver later arrived at the rectory with a torn newspaper page matching one previously sent by the thief as identification. Despite this, due to the massive disparity in the amounts offered, the negotiations stalled and no exchange was completed. On November 25, 1934, just 7 months after the theft, a stockbroker named Arsène Godertier collapsed from cardiac arrest while delivering a political speech. He was rushed to his brother-in-law's house, where he summoned his lawyer for a private meeting. According to the lawyer, Godertier whispered that he alone knew where the mystic lamb was hidden. He directed his lawyer to a specific drawer in his writing desk at home, marked with the word mutuality, and then he died before being able to say more. The lawyer and his widow eventually searched his study, and inside the desk they found carbon copies of all 12 ransom letters sent to the bishop. There was also a 13th letter that had never been mailed, and it contained a haunting clue. The panel rested in a place where neither Godertier nor anyone else could remove it without drawing public attention. Police concluded that Godertier had been the thief, or at least the mastermind behind the ransom scheme, but the investigation was disastrous. Suspiciously, his lawyer waited over a month to report the findings to the police, and in the meantime, Godertier's widow had ransacked his study and burnt all his papers. The case didn't end with Godardier's death, and if anything, it only grew stranger. One of the biggest questions is whether Godartier could have acted alone. He was an overweight man and suffered from poor eyesight, which would have made it extremely difficult to remove a large panel from a high position on the altarpiece in total darkness. The physical demands almost certainly required at least one accomplice, yet none was ever identified. Some investigators have pointed to two men named as possible accomplices, and here it gets weird again. Both of them died within weeks of Godartier, and police never conducted any investigation into their deaths. This suggests that someone may have put a hit out on the co-conspirators, with some believing that it may have been someone from within the police force itself. Then there's the question of motive, since Godartier was incredibly wealthy. He was worth more than 3 million Belgian francs in his accounts at the time of his death, so he clearly didn't need the money. He was one of the wealthiest men in Belgium, and therefore was one of its most trusted citizens. Also, as I was editing this, I realized this Simpsons reference is now probably quite obscure, so I feel the need to clarify that the line was actually a joke. And funny enough, as I was finishing this video up, I realized that my explanation was yet another Simpsons reference, but let's rally and get back on track. One hypothesis holds that he harbored a grudge against the Catholic Church because his father was ousted from a high-ranking civilian role in the church when he was young. According to this theory, the theft was an elaborate act of revenge against the specific bishop. But others believe this doesn't quite hold up, given that Godartier was himself deeply involved in Catholic life and church-related charities. A more dramatic theory ties the theft to the rise of the regime in Germany. The Austrian painter came to power in Germany just 1 year before the panel disappeared, and he had a serious fascination with the Ghent altarpiece. Some researchers believe Godartier and his associates were working on behalf of a German agent, and that the theft was commissioned to secure the panel for the Führer himself. While this theory was popular at the time, after the fall of the Third Reich, it was discovered that the Germans had sent a detective to Belgium specifically to solve the case. The purpose of locating the panel was to give it as a birthday gift for the leader himself sometime after 1940, when Belgium was occupied by Germany. Personally, I don't think it makes a lot of sense that they would go through these efforts if they already had the painting. Still, another theory implicates the diocese itself, and this theory relies on Godartier being a good Catholic who wanted to help out, even in an underhanded way. According to this line of thinking, local clergy had lost money through a failed investment and orchestrated the theft to recoup losses through ransom. Under this theory, they expected the costs of the art to be recouped through the Vatican or through the Belgian state during the ransom. At any rate, since the investigation was so poor and forensic accounting wasn't what it is today, we will never know for sure. One of the strangest chapters in the saga involves Jef van der Weken, the Belgian art restorer who created the replacement copy that hangs in the cathedral today. He was brilliant at his craft, but had a documented history of moonlighting as an art forger. His game was simple. He would offer to restore an aging piece of art, but he would actually create a virtually identical copy, returning the fraudulent art to the owner and keeping the original. Notably, he began working on his replacement in 1939, entirely of his own accord and without any commission from the church or the state. He based his reproduction on a 16th century copy that had been made for Philip II, the Habsburg King of Spain, who was then the ruler of what is now Belgium. The Belgian government eventually purchased his finished work in 1957. What makes van der Weken suspicious, aside from his other art thefts, is a cryptic poem he inscribed on the back of his replica. Written in Flemish, it translates roughly to a declaration of having acted out of love and duty, and of having borrowed from the quote-unquote dark side. Nobody has satisfactorily explained what this means, and some theorists have speculated that van der Weyken actually had access to the original panel. Notably, the Ghent Police Department still assigns a detective to the case, and the bishopric continues to receive tips every year. This isn't an entirely cold investigation either, and there has been some fairly recent activity in the case. For instance, in 2019, the authorities actually excavated a square in central Ghent after a theory emerged that the panel might be buried beneath it, but they found absolutely nothing. Over 90 years later, the Just Judges remains one of the most sought-after missing artworks in the world, and there's a good reason for this. The speculative value of the panel is presently thought to be around $100 million, which makes this simple operation one of the biggest art heists in history. Long before scientists arrived at a quiet hillside southwest of Beijing, locals already knew something strange was buried in the earth. They called the place Dragon Bone Hill, named for the peculiar bones that kept turning up in the limestone, which villagers sold to apothecaries as traditional medicine. What they didn't realize was that those bones belonged to creatures far more significant than any mythical dragon. In 1918, Swedish geologist Johan Gunnar Andersson was directed to a fossil-rich cave system near the town of Zhoukoudian, roughly 50 kilometers from Beijing. By 1921, Andersson and Austrian paleontologist Otto Zadansky had begun formal excavations, and Zadansky quietly discovered a human tooth at the site. When he finally reported the find in 1926, the scientific community took notice. Canadian anatomist Davidson Black, working at the Peking Union Medical College, secured Rockefeller Foundation funding to launch a systematic excavation. Based on isolated teeth, Black classified the specimens as a new genus and species in 1927, calling it Sinanthropus pekinensis. It was a gutsy move based on very little physical evidence, but Black was convinced something monumental lay waiting in the caves. He wasn't wrong, and on December 2, 1929, Chinese geologist Pei Wenzhong made the breakthrough. Working deep inside a frigid 40-meter crevasse with nothing but a hammer and a candle, Pei extracted a nearly complete skull cap from the red sandy clay. It was the first substantial cranial evidence of what we now classify as Homo erectus ever found in China. The discovery electrified the paleontological world and reshaped conversations about human evolution. Over the following years, excavations at Zhoukoudian yielded an extraordinary haul. By 1937, scientists had recovered over 200 fossils from more than 40 individuals, including 5 nearly complete skull caps, numerous teeth, jawbones, and limb fragments. They also found thousands of stone tools and evidence of controlled fire use, painting a rich picture of early hominids who had inhabited these caves around 500,000 years ago. Davidson Black didn't live to see his life's work threatened. He died of a heart attack at his desk in 1934, reportedly with one of the skull caps sitting right in front of him. German anatomist Franz Weidenreich, who had fled Germany, was appointed to continue the research. Weidenreich proved meticulous, overseeing the creation of detailed plaster casts, photographs, and scientific illustrations of every specimen. This painstaking documentation would later prove to be an act of extraordinary foresight, given the uncertainty and conflict that was on the horizon. In 1937, Japan invaded China proper after having previously invaded Manchuria about a half-decade earlier, and excavations at Zhoukoudian ground to a halt. Reports emerged of brutal treatment of workers at the site, including the slaying of at least 3 laborers by Japanese soldiers. As the conflict intensified, the safety of the fossils became urgent. Weidenreich transferred the collection to a safe at the Peking Union Medical College, hoping an American-run institution would offer protection. He figured that the Japanese wouldn't be silly enough to attack an American college in China and bring down the full force of the United States on the island. But despite believing in his plan, Weidenreich repeatedly urged college head Henry Houghton to authorize shipping the fossils to the United States just in case. Houghton initially refused, and it wasn't until September 1941 that the U.S. Embassy finally authorized the transfer. Weidenreich departed China that year, taking his casts and research notes to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. What happened next remains one of the most agonizing mysteries in the history of science. In late November 1941, the fossils were carefully wrapped in cotton, tissue paper, and gauze, then packed into 2 wooden military footlockers. The plan was straightforward. U.S. Marines would transport the crates from the Peking Union Medical College to the port city of Qinhuangdao. There they'd be loaded onto the SS President Harrison and shipped to the American Museum of Natural History. The fossils left the college on December 4th, 1941, and 3 days later was December 7th, which, to quote Roosevelt, was a day that would live in infamy. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the SS President Harrison was intercepted by Japanese ships and ran aground before it could reach port. The Marines who were supposed to oversee the fossils' safe passage were taken prisoner, and the 2 footlockers containing the remains of at least 40 Homo erectus simply vanished. No one has ever definitively established what happened to them after they left the medical college that December morning. Japanese scientists, who had coveted the collection, raided the laboratory shortly after and were reportedly furious to find the fossils gone. They had planned on using these fossils to prove that humans came from Asia, with the intent being to prove that the Japanese were the most superior of all. An American lab associate was held and interrogated for 5 days about their whereabouts, but he couldn't provide answers because he genuinely didn't know where they'd ended up. In the decades since then, theories about the fossils' fate have multiplied. Some researchers believe the crates made it as far as Camp Holcomb, the Marine base near Qinhuangdao, but were never loaded onto a ship due to the chaos of the Pearl Harbor attack. If that's the case, an officer may have buried them near one of the camp's permanent structures, intending to retrieve them later but never surviving to do so. Others have speculated that Japanese soldiers intercepted the crates during transport and either confiscated the contents or, not recognizing their value, discarded them. One persistent rumor suggests the fossils ended up aboard the Japanese vessel Awa Maru, which was sunk by an American submarine in 1945. Another disturbing theory holds that the bones were ground up and sold as traditional medicine, their scientific significance completely unknown to whoever possessed them. The search efforts over the years have been colorful to say the least, and oddly various federal agencies have investigated leads at various points. A mysterious woman claiming to be the widow of one of the Marines guarding the fossils once met a Chicago businessman at the top of the Empire State Building. She showed him photographs she said depicted the missing bones and then vanished forever. Other verified con artists periodically surfaced claiming to possess the fossils, demanding million-dollar ransoms. One desperate researcher even enlisted a professional psychic who had previously attempted to locate Bigfoot using a dowsing rod. Unsurprisingly, though, none of these less conventional efforts produced results. The most credible lead emerged in 2010 when paleoanthropologist Lee Berger at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa received an email out of the blue. It was from Paul Bowen, son of former Marine Corporal Richard Bowen. The elder Bowen hadn't been at Camp Holcomb when the fossils first went missing in 1941. He'd been stationed there in 1947 during the Chinese Civil War, when the camp was caught between nationalist and communist forces. According to his account, while digging foxholes one night, As the base came under attack from tens of thousands of communist soldiers, he unearthed a wooden crate filled with bones. Under fire, he reburied the box and used it as a makeshift machine gun nest, after which he was captured shortly afterward and never returned. Berger verified Bowen's identity and military records, then traveled to Qinhuangdao where he linked up with Chinese scholars. A local historian, who actually remembered the American Marines, helped them locate the former site of Camp Holcomb, and what they found was disheartening. The area had been completely industrialized, covered in warehouses, roads, and asphalt. The most probable location of the buried crate now sits beneath a parking lot. The team couldn't excavate, but noted the area was slated for redevelopment, which could allow for future investigation. Local cultural heritage authorities committed to monitoring any construction for signs of the footlockers. However, many people have questioned whether a developer who came upon these priceless cultural artifacts would turn them over to the authorities. After all, this would be the permanent end to any development on the site, with no guarantee of any sort of recourse against the government. The loss of the Peking man fossils is often called one of the greatest tragedies in science history. They represented the largest collection of Homo erectus remains ever found at a single site. No chemical analysis or advanced testing was ever performed on the originals before they disappeared, meaning entire categories of scientific inquiry were closed. Modern techniques like DNA extraction and isotopic analysis could reveal extraordinary information about these early humans that simply can't be obtained from plaster casts. Yet there's a small consolation in Weidenreich's extreme thoroughness and dedication to the project. His casts, photographs, and detailed illustrations preserved enough information that the loss didn't entirely halt scientific progress. Further yet, there's a common misconception that all the bones from the site were permanently lost, which isn't true, even if the vast majority were. Excavations at Zhoukoudian resumed after order had been restored to China and continued through subsequent decades, yielding additional specimens. But like I said, these are a small fraction of what was available, and whether the full trove will ever be recovered is anyone's guess.